Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Birth Certificate, An American History, by Susan J. Pearson, narrated by Laural Merlington. Introduction. The Life of a Document. Many years into researching and writing this book, I received a coffee mug from a friend. On one side was emblazoned the birth certificate of President Barack Obama. On the other side, a photograph of a smiling Obama captioned, "Made in the USA." The mug, of course, was an artifact of the birther controversy ginned up by a civilian Donald Trump to cast doubt on Obama's citizenship and therefore on his ability to serve as president. As many analysts have noted, birtherism was clearly racist, and President Trump's subsequent treatment of non-white female members of Congress, telling them to go back whence they came, despite their U.S. citizenship, demonstrated his basic assumption that the United States is a white man's country. Yet few analysts have noted the powerful political work that Obama's birth certificate was summoned to do. Emblazoned on my mug, reprinted in countless publications, and broadcast across the television news, the bureaucratic form mobilized its boxes, its official paper, and its mute ordinariness to supply facts in the face of falsehoods, to offer up the epistemological foundation for citizenship and belonging. That Obama's birth certificate was summoned to do this work owes not simply to the 14th Amendment and its guarantee of birthright citizenship. Instead, it owes to a function that birth certificates have been made to perform only in the recent past: proof of identity. When the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, very few Americans would have had birth certificates to prove that they had been born on U.S. soil. The U.S. government did not yet issue standardized passports, and the Department of State did not ask applicants for a birth certificate to prove their citizenship. Indeed, in 1868, even those few Americans who had had their births registered would have been unlikely to ever use a certificate of birth to establish the facts about themselves: their name, place and date of birth, their parentage, their nativity. Instead, if questioned about any of these, they would have relied on the testimony of relatives, friends, and neighbors, or they would have adduced the family Bible or other personal papers. President Obama's political advisers hoped that the release of his birth certificate would settle the matter of his citizenship, not because birth certificates are inherently citizenship papers, but because in the preceding century and a half, a host of individuals, civic organizations, and governmental officials at all levels, from city and county to state and federal, have made them so. These men and women waged a long and iterative campaign that made birth registration universal in the United States and transformed birth certificates into trusted, authoritative identity documents. Today, nearly every baby born in the United States is registered, and birth certificates are the breeder documents that generate those that are in even more common use: driver's licenses, Social Security cards, and passports. This book describes both sides of that story: how birth registration became universal and how birth certificates were transformed into portable identification long before any forms of identification were routinized and standardized. Reformers from the 1830s through the 1950s convinced municipalities and states to adopt laws requiring registration at birth. They taught city clerks and state registrars to value human bookkeeping and to issue standardized forms. They convinced policymakers that birth registration could be a source of important public health data. They encouraged parents to value birth registration and to cherish the token of that act by pasting their baby's certificate into a baby book or framing it on the wall. They push states to make birth certificates into proof of age for employment and old age pensions, or proof of race for access to marriage, schooling, and land. And they argue that because birth certificates were made by disinterested state officials, these documents were more trustworthy than the testimony of neighbors and more reliable than dates scrawled into the family Bible. We know that these campaigns were successful, not simply because the contemporary United States has universal birth registration. Success is measured also by what it means to fail. Anyone without a registered birth, or without easy access to their birth certificate, is at a severe disadvantage. Indeed, birth registration is considered so fundamental to modern citizenship that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child names it as a fundamental human right. Birth registration affords children official legal personhood, a name, a birth date, and therefore an age, a family, and a country. Birth registration makes a child known to a state, and a child who is known can be more easily protected from being forced to marry, soldier, or work underage. A child who is known belongs to a country and is entitled to its protections and entitlements. A child who is known can move freely and return to her country of origin. A child who is registered has legal parents who have legal obligations to her. Across the world, more than 290 million children, or about 45%, under the age of 5, do not officially exist. While most of those children live in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, the undocumented are at a disadvantage no matter where they reside. Around the world, an estimated 1.1 billion people are unable to prove that they belong to their country of birth or residence. In the United States alone, approximately 7% of citizens, or 13 million people, most of whom are poor, cannot prove their citizenship. A person who cannot prove who they are and where they were born can easily be pushed to the margins and beyond the pale of citizenship. In the modern United States, this is precisely the effect of federal laws, such as the Real ID Act, which mandates that states validate birth certificates for the issuance of driver's licenses, or state IDs. Voter identification laws in states that require voters to submit state-issued identification at the polls. Or federal regulations that require applicants for Medicaid and other benefits to supply state-issued identification. For anyone without a birth certificate, or for anyone who does not know how to obtain theirs, or who cannot afford the fee to obtain a certified copy, the most basic rights of citizenship are tenuous. Perhaps 1% of all detainees in U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody today are U.S. citizens who simply cannot prove their citizenship. Just ask Mark Lytle, who was erroneously identified as Mexican by prison officials in North Carolina. Unable to produce his U.S. birth certificate, in 2008, Lytle was released into Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody and deported to Mexico. Despite having been born in the United States, speaking no Spanish, and having no kin there. Until his brother could locate his birth certificate and fax it to a U.S. consulate, Mark Lytle was a stateless wanderer, shifting homeless through Mexico and Central America. This is the reason that the word undocumented applies to those residents who are said not to belong in the United States. Citizenship may be a birthright, but its documentation is what counts. This is particularly true if, like those whom Donald Trump targets, your skin is not white. Birth registration does more than provide identification, however. It is also used to create aggregate data about children and their parents that can be used to construct population information and to guide programs of social welfare and public health. It allows a country to gather data about how many children are born annually, where they are born, what towns, cities, or regions, to whom, ethnic or racial groups, single or married mothers, and how, at home, in a hospital, vaginally, or by cesarean. Today, birth certificates in the United States are used to record not only identity, but also a variety of data about, for instance, prenatal care, maternal habits such as smoking, and whether the birth was covered by public, private, or no insurance. Medical journals are filled with studies that trace the relationship between birth registration and vaccination rates, and that use birth registration data to compile infant mortality rates around the world, analyze gestational weights according to maternal age and prenatal care, and track induction of post-term births, to name a few. Indeed, when U.S. reformers began to promote improved birth registration in the 1830s and 1840s, they argued that so doing would provide better public health data and improve public policy. The single act of registering a birth thus serves two functions. It creates real-time population knowledge and a technology for personal identification. It creates both populations and persons, aggregates, and individuals. These functions are linked not only by the act of registration that initiates them both, but also by the fact that individuals are made out of the categories that state-issued forms choose to track: name, parentage, place of birth, sex, and race, among others. As such, registration is at the center of how states construct their citizens and apprehend their population. The act of registration transforms a private, familial experience into a political one, linked historically and ideologically with the simultaneous development of both centralized states and individualized identities. The act of registering a live birth and the certificate that results from this act is at the foundation of the interface between individuals, identities, and states. Though all babies born in the United States today are, in theory at least, registered at birth, this is a recent historical development. At the beginning of the 20th century, only a handful of states had effective systems of birth registration, and most of the U.S. population could not produce an official government-issued document to prove name, citizenship, birth date, or parentage. It was not until 1933 that all of the then 48 states could claim to register an average of 90% or more of their live births. Of all the so-called vital events, birth, marriage, and death, registration of birth took the longest to achieve in the United States. Of course, just because babies lacked official registration papers does not mean that their births went unnoticed or unrecorded. As they had for centuries, literate families in the early United States recorded births, marriages, deaths, and other important events in the leaves of family Bibles. Enterprising slave owners recorded increase among their slaves in carefully written plantation journals. Likewise, when people had to establish the facts of their birth or other essential elements of their personal identity, 19th century courts and other institutions recognized a variety of legitimate sources of such knowledge. Foremost among these was the individual herself and her family members, all of whom were considered competent to say her birth date or age, her name, or her family connections. If such facts were in dispute, neighbors could be called in to testify as well. Unlike in a system of state-sponsored registration, this knowledge was personal, local, and often oral. Yet by the middle of the 20th century, not only was birth registration nearly universal in the United States, but the token of this registration, the birth certificate, had become a portable identification paper that displaced oral, local, and personal knowledge as the authoritative source of information about an individual. This book details how a once locally and unevenly practiced form of record-keeping became the most essential mechanism for recording and establishing individual identity. It is a story not only of how birth registration became ubiquitous, but also of how birth certificates displaced other forms of knowledge as the state gained a monopoly on epistemological authority. This shift was neither accidental nor inevitable. Indeed, data from around the contemporary world show that rates of birth registration are not predicted by development, modernization, or national wealth. Rather, birth registration is the result of policy that promotes registration and social welfare policy that demands birth documents to function. In the United States, birth registration was the object of reformist attention, and its ubiquity the fruit of considerable labor. Reform occurred in two distinct waves. Though some colonies and newly founded states had required that all births be registered, the laws were largely honored in the breach. The first wave of reform, beginning in the 1840s, was led by public health reformers, physicians, and members of the newly founded American Statistical Association, all of whom were interested in improving the nation's well-being. Their interest was less in establishing individual identities than in creating population knowledge. Birth registration, they hoped, would allow the government to know, understand, and manage its population as a whole. Spearheaded by men such as Lemuel Shattuck of Boston, reformers in several states lobbied for new legislation to centralize record-keeping and increase enforcement of registration requirements. For men such as Shattuck, the point of vital registration was to provide a more efficient means for a state to know, understand, and govern its population as a whole. Shattuck explained his reasoning in 1850. "We are social beings, bound together by indissoluble ties. Every birth, every marriage, and every death which takes place has an influence somewhere, and a knowledge of these matters, alleged to be private, may be an incalculable public benefit." As Shattuck's language suggests, successful registration efforts depended not simply on proper legislation, but also on convincing Americans that private events had public importance. Although campaigns to promote birth registration began before the Civil War, the practice was successfully established only along the eastern seaboard. For the remainder of the 19th century, birth, which, among vital events, was far less institutionalized than marriage and death, through burial, remained vastly underreported. With no established churches, no military conscription, and minimal administrative capacity at the state level, the link between birth and governance remained tenuous. By the early 20th century, a second wave of reformers again tackled the problem of inadequate birth registration. These second-wave reformers coalesced less around an abstract desire for population knowledge and more around the state's growing biopolitical investment in defining and protecting childhood. The under-registration of birth, they maintained, contributed to two central problems facing the state as it tried to foster national health through child protection. First, without birth registration, neither local, state, nor federal government could know the infant mortality rate. Without this, policies designed to prevent infant mortality could not be rationally designed or applied. Second, progressive reformers wanted to use age as an administrative tool to protect children, but they found that without birth registration, children's ages were impossible to determine. Efforts to restrict child labor, raise the age of consent, and mandate school attendance all foundered on the indeterminacy of age. The obstacles in the way of obtaining correct ages frequently proved insurmountable, complained agents of the U.S. Department of Labor sent to investigate child labor in southern textile mills in 1907. It was not just that parents were free to lie about their children's ages in order that they might work. The larger problem was that there was no external, authoritative, empirical basis for adjudicating claims of age. Incomplete and informal documentation of births made age-based restrictions on factory work, marriage, and schooling difficult, if not impossible, to enforce. Early 20th century reformers thus wished to know not simply about aggregate populations, but about particular individuals. When were they born? Where? To whom? For these questions, the birth certificate held the answer. Kept on file with the state and available as a portable identity paper, it could serve to fix age and identity. As a New York State agent of the National Child Labor Committee explained, the birth certificate was the most satisfactory proof of age to be obtained. To achieve the goal of full registration, federal agencies, such as the U.S. Census and Children's Bureaus, coordinated with national organizations, from the American Medical Association and the American Public Health Association to the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and with state and local voluntary committees. They engaged in a massive, multi-pronged, multi-agency project to build state capacity. The Census Bureau and private organizations wrote model legislation that they urged on the states so that all vital registration systems would look the same, no matter the location. They urged every city and state to use the same forms and office procedures. Federal agencies deployed field workers to states where they reformed the office practices and record-keeping habits of local clerks and centralized state bureaus. They fanned out to promote birth registration to parents at churches, state fairs, chambers of commerce, parent-teacher associations, and other local civic organizations. The federal government bolstered states' administrative infrastructure by giving them money through the Shepard-Towner Act and the Works Progress Administration to hire registration clerks and to mail and process birth certificates. By the mid-1930s, the effort to achieve full registration had been largely successful. States reformed their laws governing vital statistics collection. Medical professionals and parents absorbed the notion that a birth was of interest to the government, and a variety of public and private institutions began to rely on the birth certificate as the foundational affixation of identity. As birth certificates became more common, they also became essential to the functioning of bureaucratic systems, such as schooling, employment, military service, Social Security, and the provision of federal benefits, including land, to the nation's Native Americans. This integration of birth documents into the administration of policy tied the knot between individuals, their documents, and the state. Even then, birth registration was uneven until after World War II. Babies born in a hospital were more likely to be registered than those born at home. White babies more likely than African American. African American more likely than Native American. Physician attended more likely than midwife attended, and urban more likely than rural. Of course, these demographic categories intersected, and each of these factors could compound another. In a nation with birthright citizenship and no national system of vital registration, state and local systems of birth registration captured birth unevenly, making citizenship itself variegated and unstable. Throughout, when non-white Americans interfaced with the state to marry, enter school, register for the draft, obtain employment, vote, or collect Social Security, they were more likely to present non-standardized documentation of identity, or none at all, a problem still with us as states pass identification and address requirements for voting. This subjected non-whites to increased scrutiny and bureaucratic delays and left them at the whim of administrators who could use personal judgment to decide the accuracy of their identity claims. But even when they had birth certificates, non-white Americans were not necessarily protected by them. White supremacy was one of the bureaucratic systems that birth documents helped states and private employers administer. Southern states used birth certificates to regulate systems of school segregation and prohibitions on interracial marriage. State registrars in places such as Virginia and Louisiana made it their business to personally police racial identification on birth certificates and kept elaborate genealogical records of families they believed would try to pass by registering their newborn babies as white. Walter Plecker, Virginia's registrar, wrote to one midwife about a baby whose birth she had recently registered. Though the midwife had marked the baby's race as white, Plecker wrote that he did not consider the child's father white, even though he may be white in appearance. According to Plecker's own records, the child's father belonged to a family of mixed racial origins. Thus, neither can his child be considered as white. Plecker told the midwife that she must correct the baby's race on the birth certificate. "We are warning you," he admonished. "It is a penitentiary offense to make a willfully false statement as to color." Whether functioning to establish age, race, or citizenship, the birth certificate serves bureaucracies as a convenient technology of both inclusion and exclusion. Plecker's careful scrutiny notwithstanding, state administrators did not always get the final say. Precisely because of the birth certificate's increasing power, some Americans began to contest the facts that it recorded. The very power of birth certificates, their claim to establish the objective truth about individuals, led to a series of conflicts that showed, ultimately, how epistemologically unstable they were. The birth certificate traces this dynamic by telling the story of how and why such facts as illegitimacy, adoption, and race were removed from the face of birth certificates over the course of the 20th century. Far from being stable and neutral, the birth certificate's truths were the result of political processes that changed what was possible for the state to know about its citizens. We know very little about how birth registration came to be compulsory and universal in the United States, though historians have long used state and ecclesiastical documents, such as birth, death, and marriage certificates, censuses, and passports, as sources of information about populations and individuals. They have too often viewed them as transparent windows onto the past. Recently, however, scholars have argued that we need to look at our archives, not just through them, to interrogate the production and meaning of documents, to recover the logics and concrete practices that lie behind them, and to consider the critical role that such information gathering played in statecraft. To date, much of this scholarship has detailed the development of centralized European states, or colonial administration. Recent scholarship on race and immigration in the United States has shown that documentation practices are critical to the construction of basic categories of identity. But accounts of the rise of a documentary regime in the United States are surprisingly thin. When it comes to the politics of government population knowledge, scholars scrutinize the federal, decennial census, but ignore vital registration documents, in spite of the fact that census records have no probative value and are not considered a legal form of identification. Despite the absence of scholarly attention to the birth certificate, this apparently humble document is the foundation of individual identity and citizenship in the United States. The birth certificate tells the story of this profound change in how Americans related to the state and constructed identity. As the story of a document that was designed both as a tool.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?